transition over to our final session of today and also the conference. Amy?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. This is such a good topic. I'm really glad that we're talking about this. Our next and final speaker is Ashley Sayers. She's an IBCLC and a full spectrum doula. She's actually one of the very, very few Indigenous IBCLCs. There's like less than 0.5% of IBCLCs that identify as Native American. Um, in her work, she blends Indigenous values and evidence-based care to create a model of empowerment through education. She believes and approaches her work as if each family is sovereign and each baby and feeding journey is sacred. She strives to work with families in the creation and implementation of plans that support their own personal feeding needs. Recognition of families as sovereign maintains their role as the ultimate voice in their baby's care. I was lucky enough to see Ashley present during this year's Indigenous Milk Medicine Week. And I was just so blown away by her work and her message. I was really grateful that she was available today to present to you all. And I will give her the floor so she can talk about the healing power of human milk feeding. Thanks for being here, Ashley.
Yes, thank you for that introduction. That was so beautiful. Let's talk about nourishing resilience and the healing power of human milk feeding. So a little bit about me. I always like to kind of like start out by letting folks know. First off, thank you for letting me be here and for giving me the opportunity to share my heart and my work and to learn with you folks. I always like to let folks know I am not a public speaker. I actually do not like public speaking. I do it because, you know, we need it to be done. I think of myself more as a community keeper and a community collaborator, but I always like to let folks know, like, I am painfully shy. So if you guys want to be on camera, I would be so appreciative. You don't have to, but just know, you know, don't ever expect like a polished performance from me. Thank you. Because you will not get it. That being said, I like it when things are more interactive and we're able to have more of like a conversation, right? So it always goes better if we can kind of actively learn together. If you have any questions or comments or anything like that, feel free to just jump in. I was really excited when I hopped on here and saw like the format of presenting, because it's more like a meeting, and I was like, yes, I can talk to people. So yep, that's my favorite. So just know, you know, if you have questions or you want to hop on and ask something or have a comment, just do it. Don't feel like you're interrupting. Okay. I don't have any conflicts of interest that I need to declare. And I also want to kind of just give a little bit of a mindful notice that a lot of the things that I'm going to be covering, they're pretty heavy, right? It's pretty challenging. It's imperative that we discuss these historical events and their impacts on the community so that we can kind of understand how these things perpetuate trauma and it continues to impact us today. Please know if it gets to be too much, especially for Native folks, because a lot of it is through this lens of Native folks. It's totally fine to take a break, but also please be patient with me because I can't take a break. And of course it is heavy because it is my community. But thank you for listening to me. So a little bit about me. Amy gave a really beautiful introduction and I just really appreciated that. My name is Ashley. I am Leech Lake Ojibwe Turtle Clan. My family is the Sayers and Banks family, and I am a former tribal foster child, and I have an ACEs score of 10 out of 10. And I share that in this context in an effort to help normalize the discussion around trauma and show that it's possible to overcome or manage those impacts of trauma, right? I always am hoping that I can provide an example that even with a high ACEs score, folks can still lead fulfilling lives, achieve their goals, and contribute meaningfully to community. So as far as like what I do work-wise, I am the founder of the Native Breastfeeding Coalition of California and a recipient of the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee's Native Knowledge Award. I spent my foundational lactation years working in a really, really busy hospital We had about 4,200 patients annually, and it was baby friendly. And I always affectionately say I got trained by like the best people in the game. Like I had the best mentors. Now I own and operate my own high volume private practice in unceded Cahuilla lands, which is in Southern California. I'm a full spectrum doula and an IBCLC, and I intentionally serve folks who have Medicaid. I do this as a way to increase community access to skilled and trauma-informed care, and to support my students and mentees in the nuances of offering that community care, because there is a lot that goes into it, right? I'm always open to ongoing connection. All of my contact info is at the bottom, and I will share my slides at the end. But you can always email me or find me on social media. I love to connect with folks. And kind of talking about like the goals of the presentation, right? Like what we want to learn. We want to understand the role of breast and chest feeding in healing trauma. We want to explore the impact of historical and contemporary trauma, especially through this Native American lens, right? We want to discuss actionable strategies for resilience and empowerment. And as we're discussing these impacts, on the access to human milk in the Native community, I also want to invite folks to like reflect upon these areas of access in your own community and for those that you serve. How has access been interrupted for your folks specifically, or the folks that you're serving? And then make sure that we apply these lessons to our own community, right? So we're going to explore the connections between mind, body, and milk medicine, particularly through this lens of Native American communities. And it's relevant across communities, and it's significant for several key reasons. One, we have resistance. It allows us to understand the chronological and contemporary events that impact our access to human milk and those generational benefits for the mind and body. It's really important to understand and always kind of keep in the forefront of our minds that offering human milk doesn't just benefit where we are right now, right? It benefits our own health and the health of our children for multiple generations. Reclamation, it allows us to understand that human milk feeding is the traditional norm for feeding infants, and that although access to it has been disrupted, we can return to human milk feeding as the norm for our community and for other communities. And it also allows us to look at this idea of rematriation. So it allows for the restoration of these matriarchal and nurturing aspects that have been disrupted or diminished through colonization and other forms of oppression. Through our own learning, we're reclaiming Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and governing that are often centered on these matriarchal values. And lastly, we have resilience. It allows us to adapt, recover, and grow stronger in the face of adversity and challenges, as that applies to access to human milk feeding. So before we can kind of like understand those things, we kind of have to have a basic understanding of like historical background, right? For folks who work with Native populations specifically, you may know that we have reduced rates of breastfeeding, both in initiation and duration. And one thing that I always like to kind of explain is that's not necessarily like our fault, right? There's a lot of things that go into that, and it's multi-layered, and it all really impacts all of those different things that make that human milk accessible for us. So this is like a huge timeline, and we're not going to go into all of it, right? We're not even going to talk about like most of it, but we're going to talk about these aspects that really do impact access to human milk feeding. So before 1492, we have this pre-encounter where there were millions of Indigenous people, right? And then we all know what happened in 1492, and then the colonial period started, and then we had these ongoing, deliberate, and intentional efforts to destroy Native populations, both through warfare and ongoing harm. So pictures that you can see here up in the upper right-hand side, you can see essentially like a Indigenous society and all the amazing things that they had going on, their homes, their gardens, their collaboration. Down on the bottom left, you see a map that outlines North America before colonization, so different groups of Indigenous folks. And then on the bottom right-hand side, we have a map that shows current Native American reservations in the continental US. So we see this huge shrinking, right? Okay, So in 1801, those first residential schools opened, and this was after we had this ongoing war and all of that stuff happening, but kind of moving us into these more contemporary aspects, right? So residential schools are this network of boarding schools across Turtle Island for Indigenous people, and they had mandatory attendance laws. So children were essentially like scooped up between the ages of 3 to 5 years old and placed into these schools where they were placed so that they could be assimilated and learn how to essentially act not like Native Americans. These schools were often run by Christian churches and were rife with abuse, neglect, and the death of the children, which incited generations of trauma. This is the photo that shows some students at a boarding school. One thing that I like to point out about this is, well, there's several different aspects, right? Like you can see everyone is looking in the same direction, very assimilated. Everyone looks the same, is dressed the same. All of these Indigenous children came from different groups and different tribes, and they were all kind of placed together and forced to assimilate together. There are a lot of children and very few staff members as well. And I mean, we can all do our own, thought process on what goes into all of that as well. These are some children that were forced to work on the farm at Carlisle Boarding School. Again, children out there farming, throwing food and all of that, not in a good way. But and then this is one of my favorite pictures as a representation of residential schools, right? So the goal of residential schools was essentially to kill the Indian and save the man. It was to assimilate Native children and to kill that culture and prevent access to it. So one of the things that often happened was these children would be scooped up and placed into these residential schools, and then they would be told these really awful lies, like your family didn't want you, that's why you're here, things that were aimed at disrupting access to their culture, not just access, but the desire to access one's culture. And so this is a really powerful image of resistance. And what it is these parents, these Native parents, came and they actually made a camp and put up their teepees right in front of this residential school. And they were singing and dancing, and they would have ceremony out there so that their children were still able to recognize and know that they were still loved, they were still wanted, and it wasn't something that was by choice, right? We also have this ongoing killing of the buffalo. This was intentional to disrupt Native food sources and to manufacture dependence on the government. Unhealthy rations were given, and those started to create disease and illness for a lot of Indigenous people. This eliminated food sovereignty and self-determination, and it really manufactured this dependence on the government for survival. We also had this aspect of creating dietary guidelines, right? So when we're talking about residential schools and the things that happened there and the trauma that began there, one of the things that happened was these experiments. And what they did was they carried out experiments on starving Native children where they denied them food, and they would give them like vitamins, right? So that they could see what is the bare minimum that we can feed a human to keep them alive. And we still see that today in the implementation of our dietary guidelines. That's where these came from, studying these Native children. And so these pictures are children that participated in these studies. In 1968, the American Indian Movement was founded in response to these issues to help promote sovereignty, self-determination, and cultural revival. And now we have ongoing civil rights issues that are still occurring. Those include things like mass incarceration, police brutality, broken treaties, forced assimilation, economic and social conditions that manufacture poverty in Native communities. Am I going too fast, you guys? I feel like I'm just like, okay. So
no, I'm totally I'm feeling it. I'm absorbing it all. So this is great.
Yeah, I tried to, there's just so much, and trying to like condense it all down and be like, this is how we got here. It's so much, right? But then when we think about like perinatal, right? Like these things that have had those effects. Of course, all of those things are going to have impacts, right? And then we have these aspects that also directly impact us. In the 1970s and actually well into the 80s, there's a lot of documentation on this. Doctors in the United States were sterilizing Native American women at rates of 25 to 42%, women of childbearing age, some of them as young as 15%. And so we're talking about, you know, nearly half of our women of childbearing age were sterilized so that we could not go on to have more children. And this really wasn't very long ago. I mean, my husband was born in that year. So this is not, you know, pretty recent. In 2017, we continue to have this in access to healthcare. There was a study that said that per capita spending for IHS patients was less than half of the average nationwide spending on healthcare. IHS is Indian Health Services, so it's almost like clinics that we get to go to if we're Native, right? So we're basically receiving half the amount of care that other folks are receiving. In 2019, the American Indian and Alaska Native pregnancy rate is 2.5 times higher than in white counterparts. In 2021, we're still seeing double incarceration rates in both state and federal prisons for American Indians and Alaska Natives. So we're talking about, you know, family disruption, children separated from their families and their cultures. 2022 infant mortality rate for American Indian and Alaska Native infants is 9.06 in comparison to 5.6 for counterparts. And this number is continuing to rise in our community. In 2023, the state of California, where I live, stopped charging child support for children that are in foster care from low-income parents. And we're actually going to discuss that a little bit more as well. In the state of California at that time, they eliminated $500 million in uncollectible foster care debt. And then, as Amy mentioned, now, you know, 2024, we only have 25 total American Indian and Alaska Native IBCLCs, like for our whole community, for all of us that exist, which is really not enough. Especially when we think about all of these different multi-layered aspects that can incite trauma and being trauma informed. So we also have this ongoing mass removal of Native American children, and this happened in all kinds of different ways, right? When children were removed, not just Native children, but other children as well, parents were referred to the state's child support program. And so what they were doing was they were charging them money, oftentimes like an insurmountable amount of money for most folks, especially when we're talking about folks who are in poverty. Common reasons for these removals included aspects of poverty and food insecurity that was rebranded into neglect, even though this was something that was intentionally and strategically manufactured. And also for cultural differences like co-sleeping and baby wearing. They were kind of rebranded into these savage or uncivilized practices, and children needed to be removed so that they could be taught otherwise. Montana stopped charging parents for their children being in foster care in 2023 after a recommendation from the federal government. So that's really, really recent. And there were, you know, people that were charged money for this for forever, and it was just recently eliminated. The goal of this was to ease financial burdens on already struggling families, recognizing that these charges often made it harder for parents to reunite with their children. And not only did it make it harder, it actually made it insurmountable, right? Yeah. And there's a couple resources on there if you guys want to read some more about that or screenshot it or whatever. I didn't do a very good job citing my sources, so I just kind of plugged it in there. So the most active years for the removal of Native American children, it spans like several decades, right? And before even just like the 19th and 20th century, we had those other aspects that also impacted children's access to their parents. But we kind of went over these things: boarding schools, the Indian Adoption Project, which was a federal program encouraging the adoption of Native children into non-Native families. During these years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and state agencies aggressively removed Native children from their families at disproportionately high rates. And I mean, again, we're talking things like poverty. And one thing that's important to understand about that as well is that once folks have had children removed, any subsequent children were also removed and then adopted out, right? Usually for profit. In the 1970s, there's the Indian Child Welfare Act, which theoretically would be great, but you have to actually have access to Native families to have children in Native foster homes. And this continued, you know, it really just keeps continuing on and on. And that kind of impacts where we are today, right? So we have these different aspects that we kind of talked about. In summary, we have this systematic harm, colonization, boarding schools, cultural suppression, high rates of poverty, healthcare disparities, and then inaccess to education and employment. Educational and employment opportunities are often limited, which leads to these cycles of poverty and ongoing trauma. And then we have this ongoing discrimination and marginalization that, of course, is going to impact mental health. We have racism. Native Americans continue to face racism and discrimination regarding our ways and our practices, which leads to social and economic marginalization. We have this incredible amount of land loss and displacement, which is the ongoing loss of land and resources that continues to destabilize Native communities. And we looked at a map earlier, and it's also important to understand that when we're talking about land loss and displacement, we're also looking at in access to housing, right? All of these different aspects, financial aspects, educational, work opportunities, those are also going to impact the access that folks have to, even staying in their homelands or having a place to live. This also results in community and family disruptions, substance use disorders. High rates of substance abuse in some Native communities are both a cause and a consequence of having high ACEs. And we'll talk a little bit more about ACEs as well. You guys are probably all very well versed in ACEs given the context of the what we're doing, but yeah. And then mass incarceration, right? Native Americans are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, which leads to more children experiencing parental incarceration. So the takeaway is that generations of intentionally manufactured trauma have created historical, generational trauma and barriers for Native communities that continue to impact their access to everything, including human milk feeding. While our exploration is relevant to the Native American community, other communities are also strategically undervalued. I just learned that term on Facebook, by the way, and I love it so much. But they are being strategically undervalued and have similar stories of oppression that impact their access to human milk and its benefits. So ACEs, we're just going to really skim over this because I think you guys already know what ACEs are. Our ACEs score is a tally of different types of abuse, neglect, and other hallmarks of having a rough childhood. According to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the rougher your childhood is, the higher your score is likely to be, and the higher your risk is for later health problems. These ACEs factors are things like having abuse, both physical and sexual abuse, along with emotional abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, such as violence against your mother, having an incarcerated parent, and substance use disorders in the home. The outcomes of these ACEs are critical because they're linked to various negative outcomes later in life. Research has shown that the more ACEs somebody has, the more they have a risk for chronic health conditions, things like heart disease, diabetes, other chronic illnesses, higher likelihood of developing mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD, which is really, why we're here, right? They have a higher likelihood of engaging in risky behaviors such as substance abuse, smoking, unsafe sex, and a greater risk of developing addictions. We have these social and economic challenges that are possible, a difficulty in forming and maintaining relationships, lower educational attainment, and higher rates of unemployment, increased risks of poverty and involvement in the criminal justice system. And really, one of the biggest impacts is early death. Individuals with high ACE scores are at a greater risk of premature death. So Native American communities often experience higher rates of ACEs due to this like multi-layered combination of the discussed historical and contemporary factors. It's not just like this one thing, right? They compound, and then folks are trying to navigate all of this historical stuff on top of this contemporary stuff, on top of parenting and all the challenges that go along with that as well. And that's where we see this really, these really impactful outcomes. This is a really beautiful quote that really kind of ties it all together. It's from my grandmother's hands. What we call out as individual personality flaws, dysfunctional family dynamics, or twisted cultural norms are sometimes manifestations of historical trauma. These traumatic retentions may have served a purpose at one time, provided protection, supported resilience, inspired hope, etc. But generations later, when adaptations continue to be acted out in situations where they're no longer necessary or helpful, they get defined as dysfunctional behavior on the individual, family, or cultural level. And we're going to talk a little bit more about like what these manifestations are, right? And where we're going to see these as we're supporting families as well. So now that we understand the prevalence of trauma in Native communities, we can understand that it's due to this historical and ongoing factors, and we can't overemphasize the need for culturally relevant healing practices, such as breast and chest feeding, to help address these traumas. When we're thinking of like the difference between like historical trauma and generational trauma, historical is this kind of like collective multi-generational experience that affects a specific racial, ethnic, or cultural group. And then generational trauma is the idea that traumatic events can impact generations beyond those immediate victims. And both of those result in emotional and psychological injury that can also manifest physically. These all kind of get passed on, right? And so ways that these get passed on, we have biology. You guys are probably really familiar with epigenetics. Epigenetics is the understanding that trauma can lead to changes in our genes expression without actually altering the DNA sequence itself. These changes, known as epigenetic modifications, can be passed down to future generations. I like to kind of explain them as almost like a light switch, right? So your DNA, it is what it is. And when we're exposed to certain factors, different parts of our DNA switch on, and they make us more susceptible or like preconditioned to develop certain issues. These epigenetic changes can alter how a person responds to stress, potentially predisposing descendants to anxiety, depression, and other mental health conditions. The Body Keeps the Score talks about a storm that happened, and the children whose pregnant mothers had been trapped in an unheated house during this prolonged ice storm in Quebec had major epigenetic changes in comparison with the children of mothers whose power had been restored within a day. And so we're just talking about like a storm, right? We're not talking about this like ongoing trauma or these like systemic issues or compounding marginalizations. We're talking about this one specific storm, and whether or not their power was turned on and off was shown to have significant impact on their DNA. And so kind of taking that and applying that into different areas, we can make our own assumptions there, right? We also see a lot of prenatal stress. A pregnant person's exposure, oh my goodness, sorry, to trauma can directly affect the developing fetus. High levels of stress hormones can cross the placenta, influencing the fetal environment and leading to an increased risk of mental health issues, such as anxiety or depression later in life. We also have this instance of psychological pathways We have behavioral modeling. Parents or caregivers who have experienced trauma might unconsciously model behaviors that reflect their trauma, like hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, or substance use disorders. Kids who see these behaviors oftentimes will internalize them and adopt similar coping mechanisms or emotional responses to them. It also can impact attachment patterns. Trauma can impact a parent's ability to form secure attachments with their children. So if a parent is dealing with unresolved trauma, they might struggle with emotional availability, leading to insecure attachment in their children. And then these attachment issues in turn affect how these children form relationships and then manage their emotions as adults, right? This quote is from my grandmother's hands. It's more of like an indigenous based book. It's in a similar vein of The Body Keeps Score, but I like it better. And it says that when one settled body encounters another, this can create a deeper settling of both bodies. But when one unsettled body encounters another, the unsettledness tends to compound in both bodies. And so we kind of pick up on this like energy, right? We also see social and environmental aspects of ways that these things are passed down. In family dynamics, trauma often disrupts those family dynamics. It can lead to dysfunctional patterns of interaction that can be perpetuated across multiple generations. For example, a family dealing with the effects of trauma might experience higher levels of conflict, poor communication, or emotional neglect, all of which can contribute to the continuation of trauma-related issues in subsequent generations. Adverse experiences are interrelated, even though they're usually studied separately. People typically don't grow up in a household where one brother is in prison, but everything else is fine. They don't live in families where their mother is regularly beaten, but life is otherwise hunky-dory. Incidents of abuse are never standalone events, and for each additional adverse experience reported, the toll and later damage increases. We also see this cultural loss and trauma. Entire communities can experience collective trauma, which can impact that cultural identity, practices, and then the overall health of the community. We see that with the loss of language, traditions, cultural practices, and then we get this kind of like ongoing sense of disconnection and identity confusion in those future generations. So again, all of these compounding things, right? In our physical pathways, we see health conditions. Trauma, especially chronic trauma, can lead to physical health issues like heart disease, diabetes, immune system dysfunction. These conditions can be compounded by stress and poor coping mechanisms, such as substance abuse. And then those things are also passed down through multiple generations. And then we see this impact on lifestyle factors. If we weren't modeled good behavior and good coping mechanisms, there's a good idea or a good assumption, I would say, that we also are not going to have the healthiest coping mechanisms. And these choices can contribute to health problems that can also impact future generations as well. So one thing that's important to understand is that although those things can impact our DNA negatively, they can also impact our DNA positively, right? This is called epigenetic resiliency. So in the same way that trauma can impact us through generations, our healing does as well. Trauma is not destiny. It can look like destiny when people choose to blow their trauma through others. But when you make a deliberate choice not to pass on your trauma to others, that choice begins to mend some of the trauma. It changes what looks like a destiny of dirty pain into an experience of clean pain. Clean pain has a healing and transformative capacity, but dirty pain does not. By protecting others, especially our young children, from our trauma, we offer them safety and opportunity to build resilience. They can then pass these down to the next generation. We create more room for growth in their nervous systems by first creating more room in our own. And that's where we kind of tie into this whole aspect of breastfeeding, right? And human milk feeding, and talking about all of this like epigenetic resiliency and why it's so important to make sure that we're supporting folks in their access to human milk feeding. So our positive experiences, such as having strong social support, nurturing relationships, and healthy environments, lead to these epigenetic changes that promote mental and physical health, not just for us, but through multiple generations. And these changes can help protect against the negative effects of stress or trauma, contributing to our overall resilience. There's a 3-generation canceling to this, according to science. And this always makes me appreciate our 7 generations practice, right? And thinking of like indigenous ways of knowing and being. Our 7 generations belief or practice is this understanding that we ourselves are impacted, but so are the 3 generations before us and the 3 generations after us. So when we add those all together, we get those 7 generations. This study is really fascinating, and it talks about how much a mother rat licks and grooms her babies during the first 12 hours after their birth permanently affects the brain chemicals that respond to stress and modifies the configuration of over 1,000 genes. Pups that are intensively licked by their mothers are braver and produce lower levels of stress hormones under stress than rats whose mothers are less attentive. They also recover more quickly, and that lasts throughout the duration of their lives. They develop thicker connections in the hippocampus, a key center for learning and memory, and they perform better in an important rodent skill, finding their way through mazes. So when we take that and we kind of apply it to like humans, right? We can't ethically study humans, but what we can see is that when we're studying rats and this behavior, and we're seeing all of this like positive outcome for these babies being really intensely loved and nurtured and cared for, we're seeing all of this huge impact on over 1,000 genes, which is insane. And then we can take that and apply it to humans and make this assumption that we're also getting that as humans. And it's really, really valuable. And one of the ways that we really intensely love and groom and care for our infants is through the act of offering them our own milk. So if you've heard me speak before, you may have heard me kind of review this in the past. I came up with this idea in about 2019. And what I did was I took Maslow's hierarchy of needs and applied this into the context of human milk feeding, right? So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is this psychological theory that accounts for the order of the needs of humans. The bottom is regarded as our most basic or our most needed needs, our physiological needs. It's said that you need to have these base layers met. These needs have to be met for us to be able to ascend into these higher levels, right? Many of these needs and these layers have been disrupted by colonization and disproportionately denied to folks of color and people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Not only does this impact our everyday life, but it can also be viewed through this lens of lactation. And so when we think about like human milk and how it helps meet all of these needs, I mean, we really could talk about this like all day. So we're just going to kind of like briefly go through it because I don't want to take up too much time doing it. But when we think about like our physiological needs, of course, we have nutrition, hydration, thermal maintenance, immune support, and disease prevention. Moving into safety, you get this closeness with having your protective mammal right there with you, which is your parent. When infants are close to somebody, they actually mimic respiration. So that is a really important way to keep them safe, to make sure that they're breathing. I mean, we're taking this neonate that hasn't been breathing previously, and we're like, now do all these things. And that's really important for helping keep them safe, right? And then we have immunities and disease reduction. Moving up into these kind of psychological needs, we get into belonging and love. Breastfeeding promotes this responsiveness of the parent that helps promote their relationship. It helps create these feelings of love and being loved. We move into this aspect of esteem and self-esteem. There's a really interesting phenomenon when it comes to neglect and abuse specifically that talks about that when we are neglected, we don't necessarily blame our neglector or our abuser. We tend to blame ourselves so that we can come up with a way to essentially disrupt that behavior and protect ourselves in the future. And so when we take that and apply that to breastfeeding, and you have this kind of like give and take, supply and demand, and this ongoing responsiveness, it's really important for helping nurture those self-esteem aspects of an infant. And then it helps build that confidence for the reliability of the parent, and not just the parent, but the entire world. Moving up into like our cognitive skills, it helps foster this budding sense of independence that stems from our trust in our parent. We get this aspect of cause and effect of breastfeeding. The actions of the infant control that supply. And then aspects of self-regulation of nutrition. Babies, when they're breastfeeding, they really get to like take what they need, right? And a lot of times we don't even know how much that is, which is really amazing because they get what they need. And as long as they're growing and their diaper output is where it needs to be, then we don't stress about it, right? So we really allow them to have this kind of sovereignty and allow them to set the pace for that regulation of their nutrition. We also move up into these aspects of self-actualization where they start to develop morality. As they get older, they start to develop these respectful feeding practices, and they start to really understand that, like, hey, if I'm not respectful, I'm not going to get what I want, right? Infants that, like, if they take a nibble on their parent and they get put down really quick, they start to learn that boundary very quickly. And they start to have that respect for someone else's body and that learned acceptance of what those parental boundaries are. And then that is applicable to other boundaries out in the real world. And then we get these decreased and increased instances of certain occurrences as we're talking about this like tippy top kind of transcendent aspect. And that's also related to those physiological needs as well. We start to see, like, you know, kids who are breastfed, they have lower incidences of ear infections. That's kind of what that means. They're kind of transcending what those expectations are. So Maslow had his whole thing, right? As natives, a lot of us use what we call our medicine wheel teachings. And I like to think of these as almost like yin and yang in a way, to like oversimplify it, right? You need to have each part of that balanced out to be able to be like your healthiest self, right? And so when we think about this with breastfeeding, we can also tie in a lot of these aspects. In our emotional part, we get this co-regulation, this sense of community, this respect for the parent's body, feelings of being loved and loving in return. We get these happy hormones that are really, really important for the development of the infant and for the parent, right? Just the act of breastfeeding really changes everyone's DNA. It's really important for everyone in the family. And that respect for the parent starts to seed that respect for themselves and for everything around them. Thinking of like the spiritual aspects of it, breastfeeding is a ceremony. It's kind of the same thing each time, right? It's the same routine, which is kind of what we look at as far as like ceremony, things that like bring us comfort. We get this aspect of gathering together, asking for permission. Infants will often do these things where they express their gratitude. Usually when they're about like 4 months old, kind of give or take, they start to try to put their fingers in the feeding parent's mouth. And that's kind of their way of like saying thank you. And it's their way of like offering something in return, which is this really beautiful like expression of gratitude. It ties into these aspects of having respect for all relations, this connection to their first home, which is their feeding parent's body. And one of my favorite things about it too is this idea of honorable harvesting, right? For natives, we have this belief, this really, really strong belief and understanding that we don't ever take more than what we need, right? We take what we need and we leave the rest there, both for others and because it's not ours. And breastfeeding is also this really beautiful aspect of honorable harvesting, where infants are able to take what they're needing, but they're not taking this excessive amount, right? Thinking of these physical aspects, we get this symbiosis of the parent and the child, of course, nutrition, hydration, thermal maintenance, all the things that we talked about, and those epigenetic benefits, and then those mental health aspects. they get this continued access to needed resources. So they're not developing this idea of like scarcity, that their needs are not going to be met. That's really valuable for ongoing mental health. They get this ongoing closeness, which is so important for mental development, self-regulation of their own nutrition, their budding independence that stems from that trust in the parent. And then they get this ongoing understanding of cause and effect, right? That they get to set that supply, they actually control the flow of milk. There's a lot of different aspects of it. I mean, like I said, I could talk to you guys about this all day. I'm trying to keep it as brief as I can. So when we think about all of these different aspects, right, it's really important to understand that this human milk feeding has these really important aspects. It's an aspect of that reclamation. Human milk feeding is a traditional practice that was disrupted by these aspects of colonization and by historical trauma. By reclaiming this practice and supporting folks to offer their milk, our Native communities can reconnect with our cultural heritage, fostering a sense of identity, pride, and continuity across generations. And again, not just Native communities, all communities. Human milk feeding was the traditional feeding method for really forever, up until, you know, the last little bit of time. When we're thinking of like the grand scheme of things and how long humans have been around, human milk feeding is the norm for how infants should be fed. And we've really disrupted that, right? So it's really important that we reclaim that, not just in the Native community, but across all different communities. We talked about the buffalo, and we're not going to say too much about it again, but thinking about those kind of aspects of food sovereignty. Breastfeeding is a reclamation of our food sovereignty, and it's deeply tied to the idea of restoring our autonomy, both over our bodies, our health, and our traditional practices. Food sovereignty at its core is the right of a people to healthy and culturally appropriate food that is produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, as well as our right to define our own food systems. I didn't really talk very much about it, about like the ecological side of breastfeeding, because that's a whole other rabbit hole that we could go into, but that's a really important aspect to understand about breastfeeding as well. When we start to tie in different impacts of the infant feeding practices onto our environment, and how that impacts our environment and taking care of our world and all of that as well. So that food sovereignty, we have cultural continuity and tradition, autonomy over our own nourishment, connection to our health sovereignty, sustainability and land-based connection, and a resistance to colonial impacts, both physically and emotionally. It gives us these beautiful aspects of rematriation. Offering human milk promotes close physical and emotional bonding between the parent and the child. This secure attachment helps to break those cycles of trauma, and it provides the child with a foundation of trust, security, and emotional support. When we're talking about overcoming all of these like compounding and multi-layered aspects of historical and generational trauma, human milk feeding is a really, really vital tool for that. The act of feeding human milk is empowering for feeding parents if they have the right support and the right access, and providing them, it oftentimes will provide them with a sense of agency and a deep connection with their child, which can be especially healing for those who have experienced trauma. One of the things that I want to kind of point out about that as well is kind of talking about these like areas of access, right? Sometimes we look at breastfeeding as if it's like this personal choice, and it is within a certain context, but in a lot of ways, people don't actually have a choice whether or not they're going to breastfeed their child. If you don't have access to the resources and the support and the knowledge that you need to be able to breastfeed, you don't actually have access to the ability to breastfeed, right? And especially, you know, just anecdotally thinking about this in my own practice, I have a very small like lending library. I mentioned that I primarily serve folks with Medicaid insurance. And sometimes folks are like, well, do you really have to like have these things on hand, right? Do you have to buy nipple or breast pump flanges to provide for these folks? And trying to explain to folks who have never navigated the multi-layered nuance of poverty that no, my client can't just go out and spend $15 on new flanges is really, really difficult, right? There's so many different layers that go into it. And for example, if you can't spend $15 to buy these flanges, but you really need them to protect your breast milk supply, and then your supply tanks and you no longer have milk for your baby, did you really make a choice not to breastfeed, or was that choice taken from you, right? And so I guess where I would say like my own personal belief on it is I don't care how people choose to feed their babies. I care that people actually get to choose to feed their babies. And that's the real kind of takeaway there, is if we're not providing the support and the resources for people to make those choices, they're not actually getting a choice at all, right? It also provides us with these aspects of resistance. Human milk feeding is a traditional practice, and it is a form of resistance against these forces that have really sought to disrupt not only our traditional ways of life, but our actual lives. The goal of this, of course, all of these things was assimilation, getting land, essentially getting rid of natives to assert power and claim resources. By continuing and promoting breastfeeding and chest feeding, Native communities assert our right to maintain and pass down our own cultural practices, despite these ongoing and historical attempts to erase us. As breastfeeding contributes to healthier and more secure children and parents, it also lays the groundwork for future generations to be better equipped to face and heal from the trauma that's shared by our ancestors. Breastfeeding and chest feeding releases oxytocin, which is often referred to as the love hormone. It promotes aspects of relaxation, stress reduction for both the parent and the baby. And this really helps in managing the effects of trauma, including anxiety and depression. Folks who are breastfeeding tend to get a lot more sleep, which really impacts our mental health as well. And the physical closeness and hormonal interactions during feeding can help reduce the symptoms of depression and anxiety in parents, which is especially important for those resisting the legacy of generational trauma. One of the things that I did not cite in here, and I probably should have, is really some like resources that outline direct ways that human milk feeding disrupts those aspects of ACEs, right? There's studies that actually say even having someone in your home that is breastfeeding reduces instances of domestic violence and child neglect and child abuse, which is, I mean, ACEs factors, we went over those things. And even if it's someone who is like, you know, say you live with your mom or your auntie or whatever, and you're breastfeeding, it still decreases the likelihood that there's going to be domestic violence in that home. And when we take that and apply it to folks who don't necessarily have domestic violence or high conflict in their home, they're only going to be seeing these positive outcomes as well. It's also going to impact them positively. From the perspective of resistance, human milk feeding becomes a radical act of healing, reclaiming autonomy over one's body and rejecting the systems that have historically sought to both control and diminish that power. It nourishes both parent and baby in profound ways, not only providing this life-sustaining nutrient, but also serving as a form of resistance against these generational traumas and systemic oppression. For the parent, it's really an act of self-determination and resilience, while for the baby, it lays the foundation for health, empowerment, and connection, which breaks the cycles of I can't even say that word right now, sorry guys, disenfranchisement, there it is, through the power of nurturing and nutrition. I told you guys I'm not a public speaker. Breastfeeding promotes healing from this like nutritional perspective in several ways as well, both for the parent and the baby. Of course, we have this nutritional composition of human milk. One of my favorite kind of like fun facts about breastfeeding is that that milk really adjusts to meet the needs of the baby, right? It's this perfect source of nutrition. It has this ideal balance of fats, proteins, carbs, micronutrients that support an infant's development. Every time a parent breastfeeds their baby, their body actually absorbs the infant's saliva and then changes the breast milk based on what's going on in the baby's saliva. And it takes like 20 minutes to do that, which is absolutely wild. So it does that with like different aspects of like hydration, how much water is in the breast milk. If it's a hot day, you're going to have more water in your breast milk than you do on a cold day. It does that with immune boosting components, those antibodies, white blood cells, prebiotics. It's really, really fascinating. It also helps to coat the inside of an infant's gut. So think like a primer, right? Like when you're painting a house, it actually like primes the inside of the gut. So none of these like bacteria and viruses can get in, and it helps prevent illness. It has these anti-inflammatory and immune boosting benefits. We kind of went over some of those aspects already, but it helps to reduce inflammation in the infant's body. It supports healing, particularly for premature or ill infants. How many of you guys have heard, like, if somebody has something wrong, just put a little bit of breast milk on it? Have you guys heard that? Yeah. Yep. For like rashes and cuts. It actually works really well for pink eye. How many people are in here? Okay, I'll just tell you. When my son had pink eye, don't tell him I said it. They don't let me post them on the internet anymore because he's like a whole adult now. But when he was a teenager, he got pink eye, and I was nursing his sister, and he actually came to me and he's like, please, please, please don't make me put the medicine in there. Just put some breast milk in it, because it doesn't sting like the medicine and it works faster. And it totally did. But it really does have all of these like amazing health benefits. Of course, we have these probiotics, prebiotics, gut health. It enhances gut health by supplying this beneficial bacteria and promoting a healthy microbiome. This is really like a hot topic right now. If you're into studying like health at all, I feel like I saw this meme recently, and it was like, you turn 30 and now everyone's talking about like healing your microbiome. And I'm like, that's so true, right? Everyone's into like the microbiome. But breastfeeding and human milk is really, really important for healing and establishing this microbiome in a healthy way, and maintaining it throughout life. And one thing that's really, really important to understand too is that when we give an infant human milk, it actually supports the health of their microbiome, which impacts your overall health for the duration of your life. It's not just like, oh, as I'm breastfeeding, right? It's literally for the duration of your life and for those subsequent generations. A healthy gut also supports a healthy mental state and helps reduce the risk of long-term health issues like autoimmune disorders. That skin-to-skin contact and that hormonal regulation through the act of breastfeeding facilitates skin-to-skin contact, and it triggers the release of oxytocin, which is often called that love hormone. It helps to reduce stress, promotes bonding, and enhances the mother and baby's emotional well-being, contributing to overall healing. How are we doing on time? How much time do we have?
We have 5 minutes until we're done.
We're gonna go fast, and I'm gonna give you guys the slides. How about that? Okay, so thinking about these aspects of resilience, it's a community activity for sure. We have this knowledge and this support that's shared among the community and among the family. And then in here in the slides, you guys can review these later if you want to. There's different like actionable steps that folks can take to help support human milk feeding in your own community, if you're Native and if you're not Native, right? Not just for Natives, but a lot of these practices are aimed at how you can support human milk feeding for Natives specifically if you do serve our community. But these are all applicable to other areas as well. So we're just going to blast through them, and I'll share them with you guys in the slides. So in conclusion, human milk feeding is more than just this biological act of nourishment. It's this profound expression of resilience, strength, and healing, especially within that Native community. As we're working to increase human milk feeding rates within our populations and beyond, we're not only nourishing our own infants, but also restoring our cultural practices, promoting health equity, and fostering generational healing among many communities. Together, through human milk feeding, we can foster these aspects of resilience, create lasting health impacts, and ensure the strength and vitality of future generations. And the journey of this starts with each baby, each family, and each community working together to create this brighter and healthier tomorrow. Do you guys have any questions? Thank you.
Oh my gosh. I just have like the warm and fuzzies like throughout the whole presentation. I can think of a question. If someone has a question, please type it in the chat or come off mute. I'm just like really loving this idea that, especially with Native communities and maternal health, infant health, we always hear about the negative, and really a lot of our time in person last week, we kind of focused on supporting the family and birthing person like postpartum, and really giving them that time and focusing on their healing. And so instead of it kind of helping me shift even more into that of like, oh, it's important that they have that time to rest, and it's important that you don't start working out too soon, and you're not worried about losing weight, you're nourishing yourself. But it's also like they need that time so that they're healing intergenerational trauma, or their what I put it in the chat, they're resisting the legacy of generational trauma they need. How can we support that? So I think that's just really, really beautiful. And I think it's so true. What I always like had a hard time understanding, with formula, and what I was always scared about, is there are so many of our communities that don't have like clean drinking water, or their stores, are closed on Sunday and close at 7 o'clock or whatever, and they're 40 miles away from the nearest grocery store where you can buy formula that's twice as expensive than it would be at Walmart, which is 2 hours away. There's like so much barriers when it comes to poverty, to the like this intentional poverty, or I don't know how you say it, like not intentional by the person but by the systems. So I just think it's like super, I don't know, I love the way you explained all of this and explained like the importance and how it's like not a choice. It's not really a choice, and like you support people making the choice, and if they know, if they're informed but also have all the resources to make that choice. So I think it's just really beautiful way of describing all of this. So I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate you guys allowing me to come and speak. This is like definitely like almost like a special interest, right? Because there's so much that goes into it. And we always hear about these like physical and nutritional benefits, but all of these other aspects that impact like not only our mental health, but the health of our families for generations, those are kind of like swept to the side. And we don't always pay attention to them. And I always like to like remind folks, sometimes people are like, oh, I'm like stuck under the baby, I feel like I'm not doing anything. And I'm like, you are changing your grandchild's DNA right now. You are doing everything. There is nothing more that you could be doing to impact the health of your family than sitting here and loving on this baby and breastfeeding this baby.
Oh my God, I can't wait to say that to somebody. I'm
Yeah.
totally going to say that to somebody next time I see them feeding their baby, body feeding their baby. And Ashley, I know we kind of ran out of time, but we have an option on Q&A, and we'll help you if someone has a question, they can type it on there, and then we'll get a hold of you and let you answer the question via Hoover and all of that. It's really great. So please, everyone, after you digest this presentation, please go ahead and do that. Right now, I'm going to pass it over to our fearless leader, our amazing leader, Stephanie, to go ahead and close us out of this virtual space. So thanks again, Ashley. It was amazing.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Amy, for that. And thanks for all of you that are here. Just a quick thank you as we close out the 2024 Perinatal Mental Health Conference. Huge thank you to all of our sponsors, the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services, and the variety of partners we have across that entity. Huge sponsors there. Thank you so much for that, as well as all of the other sponsors we have listed on our program and in our emails and evaluations. We really couldn't put on this event without their support. And many of the folks who are attending, are here with the support of those sponsors. So I just cannot thank them enough. Again, huge thank you to all of you for making time in your days to come and to learn with us and to build connection. And we really look forward to seeing you again next year. As a follow-up, you'll be receiving an email with the evaluation link in it. We really encourage you to get in there and give us your ideas and your hopes and likes and dislikes from this conference and all of the things perinatal. We use it in a lot of different ways to inform workforce development throughout the next year. So we really value that. I'll conclude just by saying thank you all for the incredible work that you do every single day in serving moms, babies, and families of the state of Montana and beyond. It's our pleasure to be able to serve you. So we hope that this was a beneficial experience for you all. And please know you got some very lovely champions here at Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies. Thank you for your great work, and don't be strangers.